Is God a complete narcissist? That's what we're talking about today on the channel. In a video a while back, Stephen Woodford over at Rationality Rules argued that God might have some narcissistic tendencies. Let's watch.
The idea of an omnipotent God needing or wanting anything at all doesn't strike me as logically coherent, be it worship from his creation or the need, want, or desire for his creation to achieve salvation. I mean, how pathetic would it be to need worship? We tend to look down on narcissists, and yet when God does it, and in unprecedented proportion, it's somehow a good thing.
So there's a whole lot going on in this quote, but the gist of it seems to me is that there's something seriously wrong with a God that requires worship. So in this video, I'm going to break down two ways in which this argument can be understood, and then argue that neither understanding presents a serious challenge to the existence of God. I'm Cameron Bertuzzi. Welcome to Capturing Christianity, a channel that is exposing you to the intellectual side of Christian belief. If you're new to Apologetics, I've actually got some free resources that I want to give you. The first resource is a 60-page ebook that I co-authored with philosopher Dustin Crummett entitled The Rationality of Christian Theism. The second free resource is a PDF of a list of apologetics terms with definitions and explanations. The second resource is actually, in my opinion, it's invaluable if you're just getting your footing into apologetics. So to get your hands on these free resources, just click the link in the description. And yes, you can actually still get them if you're watching this on your phone. All right, so Stephen claims that there's something seriously wrong with a God that requires worship. Now, I think there are at least two ways to interpret this claim. The first way to interpret this claim is pretty straightforward. If God has a need to be worshipped, then there's something wrong with that God. That God has needs. But this is a problem because God is at least supposed to not need anything. A second way to interpret this claim is in terms of commands. If God commands his creatures to worship him, then there's something wrong with that God. That God is like narcissistic or bad in some way. And this is a problem because God can't be narcissistic. God is supposed to be perfectly good by definition. So what I'll do in this video is analyze both of these interpretations of Stephen's argument and argue that neither presents a serious challenge to theism. I think it's also worth noting here that we'll only be looking at two interpretations of Stephen's claims. It's entirely possible that Stephen intended to convey some other problem with theism. If that's the case, Stephen, just let me know and we'll cover it in another installment. So the first thing that we should do, I think, at the outset is define what we mean by worship. And actually, I think that once we do this, once we define what we mean by worship, the problem doesn't necessarily completely go away, but it does lessen quite a bit. So in a recent peer-reviewed paper on the subject, Frederick Choo defines the concept of worship as consisting of two basic components: a mental component, such as gratitude, praise, and reverence, and a ritualistic component like singing songs, gathering together to pray, and reciting scripture. So a key mental component that Choo focuses on is reverence. He points out that although we can praise and express gratitude toward our human parents, we aren't thereby reverencing them or worshiping them. Right? So worship is something much deeper than mere praise and gratitude. As Richard Swinburne puts it, quote, "Worship involves the greatest possible explicit respect," end quote. In addition, according to Choo, quote, "Theists often hold that an agent who is worship worthy must be maximally great, free from imperfections," end quote. Now, I don't know about you, but I do not think that my parents are maximally perfect. Lastly, Choo says that theists often sing songs of love to God. So to sum up the analysis, quote, "Worship involves gratitude, praise, being in awe, reverence, taking the worshipped as maximally great, and love," end quote. So, and I think that's actually a pretty good starting point. But so how can worship in this sense be used as an argument against God? So let's go back to the first way that Stephen's argument can be interpreted. If God has a need to be worshiped, then there's something wrong with that God. That God has needs. Now this is a problem because God doesn't need anything. It looks as if this concept of God is logically incoherent. So here's one way that we might turn Stephen's objection into an argument against the existence of God. Premise 1. If God exists, then he has no needs. Premise 2, God has needs. God needs worship. And then 3 just follows logically, God does not exist. So this argument is actually logically valid. The question is whether the premises are true. In response, there are at least two senses of the term needs that we need to disambiguate in order to properly assess the argument. The first sense of need has to do with survival. So for example, I need water in order to survive. The second sense of need has to do with accomplishing goals. For example, I need ingredients if I intend on cooking dinner. So let's take the first sense first, survival-oriented needs. Does God need worship in order to survive? The answer, it seems to me, is clearly no. God is a metaphysically necessary being. Failing to obtain worship from his creation doesn't mean that he's going to get all weak and then suddenly pop out of existence. God can survive just fine without worship. Hence, on the survival-oriented sense of the term needs, premise 2 in the argument is false. God does not need worship in order to survive. Let's now look at the second sense, goal-oriented needs. Does God need worship to accomplish any of his goals? Well, let's assume that one of God's goals is to obtain worship from his creation. If God has a goal of obtaining worship, then God needs worship in order to accomplish that goal. But if that's true, then premise 1 is false. Think about it. Being perfect does not imply that God has no goals. God has lots of goals. Hence, on this goal-oriented sense of the term needs, premise 1 is false. And by the way, if you think that God has no goals, then God has no goal-oriented needs, and hence premise 2 is false. Now, you might object that God would still want worship if he were to command worship, just as my commanding my children to stop fighting plausibly implies that I want them to stop fighting. Now, if this is your objection, we need to reformulate the argument. Premise 1 star, if God exists, he has no wants. 2 star, God has wants. He wants worship. 3 star, so God doesn't exist. But the problem now is that while 2 star is true, 1 star is clearly false. It doesn't follow from God's perfection, his existence, or nature that he would have no wants. Nothing about being perfect is incompatible with desiring, say, to create finite persons out of love and wanting to engage in meaningful reciprocal relationships with them. In fact, if God didn't want anything, he would be imperfect. A perfect being wouldn't be indifferent to value. Instead, a perfect being would want to promote goods like virtue and to eliminate pointless evils. That all being said, isn't there something still wrong with a God that commands worship? Doesn't that make him egotistical or narcissistic? This takes us to interpretation 2. The second interpretation says that if God commands his creatures to worship him, then God is narcissistic or egotistical. And this is a problem because God can't be narcissistic. God is supposed to be perfectly good by definition. So for what it's worth, I think this is actually a pretty sensible concern to have. And here's how we might formulate this into an argument against the existence of God. 4, if God exists, he is all good. 5, if God is all good, he does not command any worship. 6, God commands worship. 7, God does not exist. So once again, the argument is logically valid. The question is whether the premises are true. Let's take a look at them one by one. So premise 4 is analytically true. It's true by definition. Most theists should have no problem accepting it. Premise 5 is probably where most of the debate is going to take place. Premise 6, however, could be rejected as well. Some Christians might just reject that God explicitly commanded any worship in Scripture. But as I mentioned, premise 5 is probably where most of the debate is going to take place. So let's take a closer look at how an atheist might defend it. So one way to defend this premise would be to say that any being that commands worship is morally defective. When someone requests worship from someone else, they do it for bad reasons. And maybe that person is obsessed with themselves or has self-esteem issues or something else is going on. In short, there are no good reasons to command worship. All of the reasons to command worship are bad. So in response, I want to draw your attention back to the paper I mentioned earlier by Frederick Choo. By the way, I've got it linked in the description if you'd like to pick it up and read it. So one of the things that Choo points out is that what seems to drive the intuition behind premise 5 is that we think the reasons for commanding worship are egotistical. Quote, for example, we might think that when agents command worship, they do so to gain social recognition or because they are excessively concerned over their own good qualities. But what Choo argues is that our reasons for commanding worship might not be God's reasons for commanding worship. God might have non-egotistical reasons for commanding worship. So in the paper, Choo offers 2 such reasons. First, worship is good for worshipers. And second, worship allows worshipers to have a better relationship with God. Let's now unpack these two reasons in a bit more depth. So in defense of the first reason, that worship is good for worshipers, Choo argues that there are empirical studies that show that experiencing awe, one of the aspects of worship we noted earlier, has many positive effects, such as promoting humility. According to Choo, quote, experiencing awe is good for the person who experiences awe in many different ways. It gives them positive emotions, helps keep them humble, and helps them to become a better moral agent by making them more inclined to pro-social behaviors, end quote. Important to note here as well is that the positive effects of experiencing awe persist well after the experience has ended. Now, in defense of the second reason that worship allows worshipers to have a better relationship with God, Choo argues that when we fail to take time to reflect on the good qualities of those that we love, we tend to take them for granted, and our relationship suffers as a result. And this is part of the reason why we actively set time aside to celebrate people that we love. By focusing on the other person, it draws both of us closer together. And that's actually what worship does. It forces the worshiper to focus on God's goodness and helps them appreciate God at a much deeper level, bringing both parties closer together. Moreover, consider the following quote from C.S. Lewis.
I think we delight to praise what we enjoy, because the praise not merely expresses but completes the enjoyment. It is its appointed consummation. It is not out of compliment that lovers keep on telling one another how beautiful they are. The delight is incomplete till it is expressed. It is frustrating to have discovered a new author and not to be able to tell anyone how good he is. To come suddenly, at the turn of the road, upon some mountain valley of unexpected grandeur, and then to have to keep silent, because the people with you care for it no more than for a tin can in the ditch.
So Lewis is saying here that praising what one enjoys actually brings more enjoyment. And it seems plausible that this applies in the case of God. If you really sit down and think about it, it just seems so appropriate or fitting for us to revere God, given that A, we depend on him every moment of our existence, B, every good that we have is ultimately thanks to God, and then C, God is perfect. We rightly praise our parents if they're morally good, precisely because we partly owe our existence to them. So how much more fitting, then, that we praise a morally perfect God to a much richer extent, without whose continual gift of life we would literally cease to exist. So for these reasons, it's not so clear that God could only have bad or egotistical reasons for commanding others to worship him. Hence, it's not clear that premise 5 in the argument we've been discussing is true. Arguably, it's false. Hence, neither interpretation of Stephen's original objection to theism seems insurmountable. Theists can provide perfectly reasonable explanations to both of these interpretations. Now, having said that, if you're interested, check out Frederick Choo's interview on the Analytic Christian, where he explains his views in a bit more detail. I've actually got it linked in the description for your convenience. Well, I hope that you found this video helpful. If you did, make sure to give it a like and consider subscribing. I'm actually considering making more of these short videos on the channel. If you like this more than our regular content, make sure to let me know in the comments so I can start making more of this type of content. And then lastly, just remember that Christianity is true.